Imagine being woken in the dead of night by men dressed in black. Your only crime, having an opinion different from the church. You're dragged to a secret tribunal where nobody believes in your innocence. If you confess, you'll be tortured. If you deny, you'll be burned alive. Welcome to the terror of the Holy Inquisition. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX created the Holy Inquisition, a religious tribunal with a single purpose: to hunt heretics. But it was in Spain, in 1478, during the reign of the Catholic Monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, that it became a machine of fear. Kings, priests, and even neighbors transformed into informants. Thousands were tortured, exiled, or executed in the name of God. But what really happened in the dungeons of the Inquisition? The Dominican and Franciscan orders were typically appointed as inquisitors, armed with the full support of the state to carry out their grim mission. They were hunting not just heretics, but anyone accused of witchcraft, sorcery, or other supposed crimes against faith. The shadow of suspicion could fall on anyone at any time. The Spanish Inquisition was particularly ruthless during the 16th century, leaving behind a legacy of religious intolerance and persecution that echoed until its final abolition in 1834, during the reign of Isabella II of Spain. If you love history and want to uncover the darkest secrets of the medieval church like this video, subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles and don't miss a single episode. Join us as we journey through the shadows of history that still haunt us today. The Holy Inquisition wasn't born in a vacuum. Imagine 13th century Europe, a continent gripped by religious fervor and fear. The Catholic Church faced something it considered more dangerous than foreign invaders: ideas that challenged its authority. Groups like the Cathars were spreading rapidly across southern France and northern Italy. These so-called heretics believed in a world of dualism, where the material world was evil, created by Satan, not God. They rejected the church's wealth, its rituals, even the cross itself. To church authorities, this wasn't just theological disagreement, it was an existential threat. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX made a fateful decision that would cast a shadow across centuries. He entrusted the Dominican order, known as the Hounds of the Lord, with extraordinary powers to investigate, judge, and punish those deemed enemies of the faith. Think about that. Monks becoming judges, jury, and sometimes executioners. The Dominicans, with their strict discipline and theological training, were specifically chosen for this grim task. Their founder, Saint Dominic, had earlier tried to convert Cathars through preaching. Now his followers would use more forceful methods of persuasion. But what began as a targeted response to heretical movements would evolve into something far more sinister. The machinery of interrogation and punishment was established, but its true terrible potential wouldn't be realized until later. Fast forward to 1478. Spain was transforming. Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile had married, unifying two powerful kingdoms. They had a vision: one kingdom, one faith. The Spanish monarchy requested special permission from Pope Sixtus IV to establish their own Inquisition, one that answered to the crown, not just to Rome. This Spanish Inquisition would become something altogether different, a political weapon disguised as religious zeal. While earlier inquisitorial efforts targeted Christian heretics, the Spanish Inquisition had another focus: conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, who were suspected of secretly practicing their former faith. Later, they would turn their attention to converted Muslims as well. The timing wasn't coincidental. Spain had been home to one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in Europe. Many Jews had converted to Christianity under pressure, becoming some of the most successful merchants, physicians, and royal advisors. Their success bred resentment, and the Inquisition provided a perfect tool to eliminate political rivals, seize wealth, and enforce religious conformity all at once. The first Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada, himself from a converso family, became infamous for his zeal. Under his leadership, thousands would be investigated, tortured, and hundreds burned at the stake in public ceremonies called autos da fe, acts of faith. The ultimate irony, a ritual of death portrayed as a sacred act. What makes this chapter of history so chilling isn't just the physical cruelty, but how ordinary people were drawn into the machinery of persecution. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Whispers and suspicions became evidence. Did someone avoid pork? Did they change clothes on Friday evening? These ordinary acts could mark someone for investigation and torture. The blood tribunal had been born, a system that would spread terror across Spain and its future colonies for over 3 centuries. A religious court had become a tool for political control, racial persecution, and the ruthless enforcement of conformity. And its dark methods were just beginning to unfold. Who were these men who held the power of life and death in their hands? The inquisitors weren't just random clerics picked for their brutality. They were carefully selected members of the Dominican or Franciscan orders, men with extensive theological training who had taken vows of poverty and obedience. The Dominicans, known as the Order of Preachers, were particularly favored for this role. Their founder, Saint Dominic, had established the order specifically to combat heresy through preaching and education. Now his followers would use far darker methods. These weren't simple-minded torturers. Inquisitors were often scholars, experts in theology and church law. They had studied at Europe's finest universities and could debate the finest points of doctrine. Many had authored theological works and were respected intellectuals of their time. This made them all the more dangerous. They brought methodical precision to the art of breaking human beings. What's truly chilling is how systematic they were. The handbook used by inquisitors, the infamous Directorium Inquisitorum, compiled by Nicholas Aymeric in the 14th century, reads like a psychological warfare manual. Before any physical torture began, inquisitors employed sophisticated psychological tactics. A typical interrogation would start not with the rack or hot irons, but with isolation. The accused would be separated from family and friends, left alone with their thoughts and fears in a cold, dark cell. Then came the mind games. Inquisitors would visit at odd hours, disrupting sleep patterns. They would offer false hope one day, followed by dire threats the next. They would claim other accused heretics had already confessed and implicated the prisoner. Sometimes they would stage whispered conversations outside the cell door, letting the prisoner overhear that torture was imminent unless they confessed. When psychological pressure wasn't enough, they moved to physical methods. But even here, there was a calculated progression. They would first show the instruments of torture, explaining in excruciating detail what each device did to the human body. The accused would be made to watch others being tortured before experiencing it themselves. And when torture began, it started subtly: stress positions, sleep deprivation, and minimal food, before escalating to more severe methods. Most disturbing of all, many inquisitors genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They weren't cackling villains reveling in suffering. They saw themselves as spiritual physicians, causing necessary pain to save an eternal soul. In their minds, a confession followed by execution wasn't a tragedy, but a triumph. The heretic's soul had been saved from eternal damnation, even as their body burned at the stake. Take Bernard Gouy, a famous inquisitor from the early 14th century. In his personal writings, he speaks of feeling genuine sorrow when condemning someone to death. Yet this compassionate man sent hundreds to the flames. Or consider Tomás de Torquemada, Grand Inquisitor of Spain, who lived an austere life, refusing comfortable quarters while sending thousands to their deaths. He reportedly wept while ordering executions. Tears not for the suffering he caused, but for the souls he believed were choosing hell through their heresy. The psychology here is fascinating and terrifying. These men had constructed a moral framework where cruelty became kindness, where torture was an act of love. By saving the soul through destroying the body, they could justify any atrocity. It's a chilling reminder of how even educated, intelligent people can commit horrific acts when they believe they have divine justification. And here's a detail that brings their mindset into sharp focus. Inquisitors would often tell the condemned that the flames that burned their body on earth were actually saving them from the eternal flames of hell. The pain of execution was portrayed as a blessing, a momentary suffering that would spare them an eternity of torment. With this twisted logic, the inquisitors could sleep soundly at night, convinced they were merciful shepherds rather than merciless killers. Now, I need to warn you, what I'm about to describe isn't for the faint of heart. The Inquisition's torture chambers were places where human creativity took its darkest turn, where pain became an art form practiced with religious dedication. Let's start with one of their favorite devices, the strappado, also known as the pulley. Imagine having your hands tied behind your back, then being hoisted by a rope attached to your wrists. Your entire body weight pulls down on your shoulder joints as your feet dangle above the ground. Most victims' shoulders would dislocate within minutes, but the inquisitors weren't satisfied with that level of agony. They would often attach weights to the victim's feet, increasing the pressure. Sometimes they'd suddenly drop the victim a short distance before jerking them to a stop, causing even more devastating damage to the joints and spine. The witch's chair might sound like an innocent piece of furniture, but it was anything but. Picture a metal chair completely covered in sharp spikes, hundreds of them, on the seat, armrests, backrest, and even a metal band that would close over the chest. The naked victim would be strapped tightly to this chair, with the spikes penetrating their flesh at every point of contact. As if this weren't excruciating enough, the chair was often heated from below with burning coals, slowly cooking the victim's flesh, while the spikes prevented them from moving away from the heat. The torture could last for hours, with interrogators periodically tightening the straps to force the spikes deeper. Then there was the breaking wheel, perhaps the most visually horrifying method of all. The victim would be spread-eagled and tied to a large wooden wheel. The executioner, using an iron hammer or a heavy bar, would methodically break each limb between the joints, shattering bones rather than breaking them cleanly. After every bone in the arms and legs was broken, the mangled limbs would be threaded through the spokes of the wheel. The wheel would then be mounted on a pole, where the victim might remain alive for days, suffering unimaginable pain while exposed to the elements and unable to move without causing further agony. Some particularly unfortunate souls were kept alive with water and food to prolong their suffering. What's particularly haunting about these methods is how they were justified as being technically bloodless. The Church had prohibitions against shedding blood, so these tortures were seen as acceptable loopholes. The inquisitors even had doctors present during torture sessions, not to alleviate suffering, but to ensure the victim wouldn't die prematurely, robbing them of their confession or execution. It's no wonder that many people confessed to crimes they never committed just to end the torture. A woman accused of witchcraft would admit to flying on broomsticks or consorting with demons. A man suspected of heresy would confess to blasphemies he'd never uttered. Anyone would say anything to make the pain stop, and that's exactly what the inquisitors counted on, not to discover truth, but to confirm what they'd already decided. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical pain. The torture room was designed to maximize fear before anything even happened. Tools would be displayed prominently and explained in detail. Victims would hear the screams of others being tortured. The anticipation of pain often broke people before the actual torture began. And for those who survived, the trauma remained forever, with many developing what we now recognize as severe PTSD, jumping at sudden noises, suffering nightmares, and living in constant fear. Did you know that many so-called witches were simply women who knew about medicinal herbs? Midwives, healers, and wise women who had knowledge passed down through generations became targets because their understanding of natural remedies seemed supernatural to the ignorant. Their crime? Being knowledgeable women in a time when that was seen as dangerous. If you're enjoying this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, please like this video, share it with others who appreciate uncensored history, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles. I'm curious, do you think you would have had the courage to face the Inquisition? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And stay tuned, because next we'll explore the infamous public executions that turned death into a spectacle. When we think of heretics, we might imagine wild-eyed radicals preaching dangerous ideas in town squares. But the reality of who fell victim to the Inquisition tells a far different story, one that reveals the institution's true purpose wasn't religious purity, but social control and power consolidation. Let's begin with the conversos and moriscos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity who became the primary targets of the Spanish Inquisition. For centuries, Spain had been a relatively tolerant place where Christians, Jews, and Muslims coexisted. This changed dramatically with the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed to America, Jews were given a brutal choice: convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Many chose conversion, becoming known as conversos. Muslims faced similar pressure, with those who converted called moriscos. But conversion wasn't enough to save them. The Inquisition began targeting these converts, claiming they were secretly practicing their former religions. Think about the impossible situation. If they refused to convert, they lost everything. If they did convert, they were still suspected and watched. Ironically, many of the most zealous inquisitors came from converso families themselves, perhaps trying to prove their Christian devotion by persecuting others. The evidence used against conversos was often absurdly trivial. Changing into clean clothes on Friday evening? You must be secretly celebrating the Jewish Sabbath, avoiding pork, clearly still following Jewish dietary laws, bathing frequently, obviously practicing Muslim cleansing rituals. One woman was investigated because neighbors reported she cleaned her house on Fridays and wore better clothes on Saturdays. Another was denounced for not having pork fat in her cooking. These weren't dangerous religious radicals. They were ordinary people whose cultural habits made them targets. The Inquisition also turned its sights on intellectuals and scientists who dared question established dogma. The most famous case is Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake in 1600, not primarily for supporting the Copernican view that Earth revolves around the Sun, as is often claimed, but for his broader philosophical views that challenged church doctrine. He proposed the universe was infinite, with many worlds potentially inhabited by other beings, ideas that threatened the church's cosmology, placing Earth at the center of creation. Galileo Galilei narrowly escaped Bruno's fate. When his observations with the newly invented telescope supported the Copernican model, he faced the Inquisition in 1633. Unlike Bruno, Galileo recanted under threat of torture. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, his works banned. Legend says that after formally denying that the Earth moves around the Sun, he muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves." Or whether he actually said this or not, the story captures the tragedy of scientific truth suppressed by dogmatic power. Then there were the women, thousands of them, accused of witchcraft. While the witch hunts weren't exclusively an Inquisition phenomenon, the Church's demonology provided the intellectual framework that made them possible. Women who were healers, midwives, or herbalists possessed knowledge that seemed mysterious to male authorities. Women who owned property independently or lived without male guardianship defied social norms. Women who were outspoken or refused to conform to expectations became threatening figures who must surely be in league with the devil. Consider the case of Angélique de Coudray. not executed but harassed by the Inquisition in 18th century France. Her crime: developing an obstetrical mannequin to train midwives and reduce infant mortality. Medical knowledge in female hands was seen as threatening the male-dominated medical profession. Or think about the countless unnamed women executed because they knew which herbs could ease pain or prevent pregnancy. Knowledge that gave them power in a society determined to keep them powerless. What's particularly revealing is how property confiscation worked. Once accused, a person's assets were immediately seized by the Inquisition. Remarkably, wealthy individuals were disproportionately targeted, even if eventually found innocent, a rare occurrence. Much of their wealth was gone, consumed by court costs. This financial incentive helps explain why rich conversos were particularly vulnerable. Their success made them both envied and lucrative targets. The pattern becomes clear when we examine who was punished. Rarely the powerful, unless they had fallen from political favor. Frequently, the marginalized, often those with assets that could be seized. Commonly those who in some way challenged the established order, whether religious, scientific, or social. The Inquisition, while clothed in religious language, functioned as a tool for maintaining social hierarchy and eliminating perceived threats to authority. Perhaps the most heartbreaking victims were the ordinary people denounced by neighbors over petty disputes. A woman accused her neighbor of witchcraft after a quarrel over a borrowed pot. A man reported his business competitor for heretical statements after losing a contract. The Inquisition created a society where anyone could destroy an enemy with a well-placed accusation, turning communities into networks of fear and suspicion. The real crime of most victims wasn't heresy. It was being inconvenient to someone with power, however small that power might be. While inquisitorial courts existed across Europe, none achieved the scale, efficiency, and sheer terror of the Spanish Inquisition. What made the Spanish version so uniquely terrifying wasn't just its methods, it was how deeply it penetrated society, turning neighbor against neighbor in a climate of paranoia that lasted for centuries. At the center of this machinery of fear stood one man, Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain. A Dominican friar with eyes described by contemporaries as piercing and severe, Torquemada was the confessor to Queen Isabella herself before being appointed to lead the Inquisition in 1483. What makes his story especially fascinating is that Torquemada himself came from a converso family. His own grandfather had been a converted Jew. Perhaps this heritage drove him to prove his Christian zeal beyond any doubt. The numbers associated with Torquemada's 15-year reign as Grand Inquisitor are staggering. Under his leadership, more than 2,000 people were burned at the stake, and thousands more suffered lesser punishments like imprisonment, flogging, or confiscation of property. Some historians suggest these figures might be conservative. One chronicler from the time wrote that Torquemada filled the world with fear. He wasn't exaggerating. What's often overlooked is how the Spanish Inquisition transformed daily life into a landscape of suspicion. Think about this. In some Spanish towns, as many as 1 in 5 residents served as informants for the Inquisition. Imagine looking around your neighborhood and knowing that several of your neighbors might be reporting your every move to authorities. Did you skip Mass last Sunday? Are you washing your hands too frequently? Did you accidentally mutter something that could be interpreted as blasphemy? The consequences could be fatal. Spanish society became a place where envy could be weaponized. A merchant, envious of his competitor's success, might whisper to an inquisitor that he'd seen the man avoiding pork. A farmer coveting his neighbor's land could suggest the neighbor's good harvests came from witchcraft rather than hard work. A rejected suitor could accuse the woman who spurned him of heretical statements. The Inquisition created a perfect system for transforming personal grudges into deadly accusations. Entire families would be destroyed based on flimsy evidence or malicious rumors. Take the case of the Rodriguez family in Toledo. When their successful textile business began outcompeting others, neighbors reported seeing them lighting candles on Friday evenings, supposedly a secret Jewish practice. The entire family was arrested. The father died under torture, the mother was burned at the stake, and their children were stripped of inheritance and forced into monasteries and convents. Their accusers divided their property among themselves. What makes this story even more tragic is that lighting candles on Friday evening was a common practice among many Spanish Christians as well. It wasn't exclusively Jewish. But in the climate of suspicion, any behavior could be reinterpreted as evidence of secret heresy. Here's something you might not know. Within the Church itself, many clergy were deeply troubled by the Inquisition's methods. Behind the scenes, numerous priests and even some bishops wrote letters to Rome, protesting the excesses of the Spanish Inquisition. One Dominican friar, Alonso de Ojeda, initially supported the Inquisition, but became horrified by its practices and began speaking out against the torture. He was quickly silenced, reassigned to a remote monastery where his protests couldn't be heard. Even Pope Sixtus IV, who had authorized the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, became alarmed by its brutality. In 1482, he issued a bull complaining that the Inquisition was being misused for political ends rather than religious ones. He ordered more merciful procedures and appealed for clemency toward the accused. What happened next shows the true power dynamic. Ferdinand and Isabella simply refused to publish the papal bull in Spain, effectively ignoring it. The Pope, unwilling to risk a political crisis with the powerful Spanish monarchy, backed down. This remarkable episode reveals how the Spanish Inquisition had become a state institution beyond even papal control. The Spanish Inquisition had another feature that made it particularly insidious. Its procedures were designed to make resistance nearly impossible. The accused were not told who had accused them or exactly what they were accused of. They were expected to confess their crimes without knowing what those crimes were. Imagine being asked, "Tell us what you did wrong," without any indication of what wrong might mean in this context. If you didn't confess, that was seen as proof of your guilt. Only a guilty person would refuse to confess. If you did try to guess what you might be accused of, your statements could be used as evidence against you. It was a perfect trap. The terror spread beyond Spain's borders as the Inquisition followed Spanish colonization to the Americas. In Mexico, Peru, and other colonies, indigenous religious practices were suppressed with the same brutal efficiency used against conversos in Spain. The Inquisition became one of Spain's most terrible exports, creating a legacy of religious trauma that some historians argue still echoes in Latin American culture today. All nightmares eventually end, even ones that last for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition, which had terrorized Europe for over 300 years, finally met its demise in 1834 during the reign of Queen Isabella II of Spain. But endings are rarely clean or simple, especially for institutions that have embedded themselves so deeply into a society's fabric. The decline of the Inquisition didn't happen overnight. It was a slow dimming of power that began in the late 18th century as Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe. Philosophers like Voltaire and Montesquieu wrote scathing critiques of religious intolerance. When Napoleon's armies invaded Spain in 1808, he abolished the Inquisition, only to have it reinstated when the Spanish monarchy returned to power. It was finally abolished for good in 1834 after a series of liberal reforms in Spain made the institution untenable in what was becoming a modern state. Think about that for a moment. The last official execution by the Spanish Inquisition took place in 1826, just 200 years ago. The schoolteacher Cayetano Ripoll was hanged for the crime of teaching deism instead of Catholicism to his students. When we think of the Inquisition, we often imagine it as ancient history, but its shadow stretches much closer to our time than many realize. What's particularly haunting about the Inquisition's legacy is how its methods and mindset echoed forward into supposedly more enlightened times. The systematic record-keeping, the extraction of confessions through psychological manipulation and torture, the public spectacles of punishment designed to instill fear, these weren't just medieval cruelties. They were templates that would be refined and deployed by modern totalitarian regimes centuries later. When the Soviet secret police developed their interrogation techniques in the 20th century, they studied inquisitorial methods. The public show trials under Stalin, where defendants confessed to impossible crimes, mirrored the forced confessions of the Inquisition. The Nazi Gestapo's approach to extracting information and suppressing dissent built upon the same psychological foundations. Even the concept of turning ordinary citizens into informants who spy on their neighbors came straight from the Inquisition's playbook. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Inquisition isn't in specific techniques of oppression, but in the fundamental lesson it teaches us about the dangers of merging religious certainty with state power. When those who believe they possess absolute truth gain the authority to enforce that truth, justice inevitably transforms into persecution. The inquisitors weren't cackling villains. They were men convinced of their righteousness, certain that their actions served a higher good. That sincere belief in their own rightness made them capable of terrible cruelty while maintaining clear consciences. There's a strange and troubling paradox here. The Inquisition was created to preserve unity and purity of faith, yet it produced generations of people who practiced their faith out of fear rather than conviction. It aimed to save souls, yet it turned the sacred act of confession into an instrument of torture. It claimed to serve truth, yet it forced countless people to lie, to themselves, to others, and to God, simply to survive. Here's a detail that brings this paradox into focus. The records of the Spanish Inquisition fill miles of shelves in archives today. The institution was obsessively bureaucratic, documenting every interrogation, every confession, every punishment in meticulous detail. Historians now study these records to learn about the lives of ordinary people who otherwise left few traces in history. The institution that silenced so many voices in life has, ironically, preserved them for posterity. But those voices come to us through the distorting lens of forced confession and extreme duress. We can never truly know how many of the confessions recorded were false, how many supposed witches were simply scared women saying whatever might save them from further torture, how many alleged heretics were actually faithful believers who couldn't withstand the breaking of their bodies. As we look back at this dark chapter of human history, we might wonder how educated religious people could commit such atrocities. The uncomfortable answer is that the distance between us and them may not be as great as we'd like to believe. The Inquisition didn't require monsters, just ordinary people convinced that their ends justified any means, that their certainty trumped others' freedom of conscience, that their vision of goodness was worth imposing by force. The lesson? When religion and power mix, when any ideology, sacred or secular, becomes so certain of its righteousness that it will destroy those who disagree, justice can easily transform into persecution. The Inquisition may have ended in 1834, but its warning echoes across time, reminding us to remain vigilant against the seductive certainty that we alone possess truth worth imposing on others. Perhaps the most important legacy of studying the Inquisition is not just understanding what happened, but recognizing the patterns of thought and institutional behavior that made it possible. Patterns that haven't disappeared from our world, but merely taken new forms. In recognizing these patterns, we gain the chance to choose a different path, As our journey through the shadows of the Inquisition comes to an end, we're left with uncomfortable questions that echo across the centuries. The Holy Inquisition wasn't simply about faith or religious devotion. At its core, it was about control of thought, of behavior, of society itself. It shows us how effectively fear can be weaponized, transforming ordinary people, neighbors, friends, even family, into informants and executioners. Perhaps the most chilling lesson from this dark chapter is that the architects of such cruelty weren't cackling villains reveling in suffering. They were men who woke each morning, said their prayers, and proceeded to authorize torture with clear consciences. Grand Inquisitor Torquemada reportedly slept on a wooden board, wore a hair shirt beneath his robes, and fasted regularly. A model of religious devotion even as he condemned thousands to agony and death. These weren't monsters, at least not in their own eyes. They were defenders of truth, protectors of faith, guardians against corruption. When Inquisitor Nicholas Emmerich wrote in his manual that torture should be applied with caution and in true charity for the salvation of the subject's soul, he wasn't being cynical. He genuinely believed that physical suffering was a small price to pay for eternal salvation. This is what makes the Inquisition not just a historical curiosity, but a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about human nature. When we become absolutely convinced of our righteousness, when we divide the world neatly into the enlightened and the misguided, when we decide that those who disagree with us aren't just wrong but dangerous, we take the first steps down a path that has led to history's greatest horrors. The mechanisms that enabled the Inquisition, group loyalty, fear of outsiders, certainty in one's own righteousness, willingness to sacrifice individuals for an abstract greater good, these aren't relics of a primitive past. They're tendencies wired into human psychology, as present today as they were in medieval Spain. So the question becomes, are we, in our supposedly enlightened age, immune to these impulses? Or do we simply express them differently? When we vilify those who hold different political views, when we rush to judgment without hearing evidence, when we silence voices that challenge our worldview, are we so different from those who lit the fires of the auto da fe? I'm not suggesting moral equivalence between modern disagreements and the horrors of the Inquisition. But I am suggesting that the psychological seeds that bloomed into that institution remain planted in fertile soil. The Inquisition wasn't an aberration of human nature. It was an expression of tendencies we all share, taken to their extreme conclusion. History's greatest value isn't in allowing us to feel superior to the past, but in holding up a mirror that reflects our own potential, both for compassion and for cruelty. The Inquisition stands as a warning of what can happen when we become so certain of our own truth that we're willing to impose it by force, when we convince ourselves that the end justifies any means, when we dehumanize those who think differently. As we close this dark chapter, I hope you'll carry forward not just knowledge of historical events, but a renewed commitment to the principles that stand in opposition to everything the Inquisition represented: intellectual humility, respect for individual conscience, and the courage to question even our most cherished certainties. If you've appreciated this journey into history's shadows, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who value these deep dives into our past, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more time-traveling adventures. Your support helps us continue bringing these crucial historical lessons to light. What periods of history would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below. Until our next journey through time, remember that understanding our past is the first step toward creating a better future.